Good evening, everybody. My name is Dave Manderson, and I'm chair of Scottish Pen Writers for Peace. Welcome to tonight's inaugural lecture. This is the first Helen Cruikshank lecture, and it's the first of what we hope will become a series of annual events where we celebrate the work of Helen and our compatriots and fellow writers through this lecture. I'm very pleased to say that tonight we have got Professor Candice Goucher from Washington State University along to deliver this lecture, and I'm hugely looking forward to what she has to say. We've posted some details of her lecture, but she's going to deliver the real thing just after I finish speaking. I've got a couple of little things to introduce as housekeeping announcements. First of all, your cameras at the moment are switched off, and that's deliberate. We're going to make sure that the only person on screen will be Candice while she delivers her lecture. And at the end of this time, we're going to have Lisa Clark, our project manager, come in and handle the chat phase of the lecture. So after this introduction, Candice will give her talk. That will last about 30 to 35 minutes. If you have any questions or comments as she's speaking, please post them in the chat, and Lisa will be busy in collating those comments. She'll then raise issues and comments for Candice, hopefully to be able to talk further about towards the end, and I'll wind up the occasion around about 8 o'clock. I think we'll feel that we've had what we can of the lecture by that time. So just to introduce you to Candice, Dr. Candice Goucher is Professor Emerita of Washington State University in Vancouver, Washington. She has worked in the Caribbean and West Africa on the archaeology and history of technology, culture and gender, publishing 17 books and many articles along the way. Professor Goucher was the co-lead scholar on the 26-part public television series Bridging World History, and co-editor of the Cambridge World History, A World with Agriculture. Her book, Congote Congote, A Global History of Caribbean Food, published by Routledge in 2014, won the 2015 and the 25th anniversary Gourmand Awards for the best book in the world on Caribbean food. She recently co-edited Striking Iron, The Art of African Blacksmiths. That accompanied the exhibition at the Smithsonian Museum of African Art and the Musée de Quai Branly, Paris in 2018 to 20. She is currently general editor for the 4-volume reference work, Women Who Changed the World, to be published later this week. She joins us today from Portland, Oregon. She's going to talk tonight about her most recent work, Women Who Changed the World, to be published later this year by ABC Clio Praeger. In her lecture, she will focus on the ways in which interconnections and networks have linked together women writers. And she's going to present her argument and her presentation about the way women have forged relationships to change the world. So without further ado, I'm just going to pass right over now to Professor Candice Goucher.
Thank you so much, David, for the very kind introduction. I'm going to start by doing the most difficult thing of the evening, which is sharing my screen. Let's see if I can do it successfully. So I'm very, very happy to join you today, although admittedly I confess that I would far have preferred to have been in one single room with you, but here we are. Together safely in our conjoined Zoom rooms. As an American situated on formal tribal lands, kindly indulge me as I also acknowledge the indigenous people whose traditional and ancestral homelands I live and work on here in the Pacific Northwest, the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Wadlala bands of the Chinook and the Tualatin Kalapuya of the Columbia River So we remember and honor them typically before lectures in the Pacific Northwest. I'm also today very happy to and honored by the invitation to present the inaugural Helen Cruikshank lecture. I've chosen as the heart of my talk what I've found to be the essence of the poet's considerable impact, her desire and success in creating a community in which writing could change the world. Cruikshank's home was a magnet for other writers. Her poetic words and her hospitality and refuge gave hope and comfort and safety while speaking truth to power. Like many women, Cruikshank likely sacrificed her full talent to be a caregiver, but specifically through her involvement beginning as a teenager, actually, in the Association of Women Clerks and Secretaries in the women's suffrage movement, and later through the establishment of the Scottish Centre of Penn in the 1920s, through the Saltire Society work in the 1930s and beyond. Cruikshank still served both to boost Scottish literary efforts and to connect Scotland in important ways to the wider world. So my theme today is about the ways in which these interconnections and networks of relationships have figured in the lives of women who changed the world. The theme of interconnected women is not only found in Helen Cruikshank's lived experience, that theme, in a sense, is also evident in the circumstances that have led me to be the lecturer and to give this lecture today, to be present with you. Through a writing relationship with one of the more than 100 authors and writers on the Women Who Changed the World project, specifically through a scholar, Saptashi Malik, in India, whom I've never met face to face, but only virtually. During this project, I was introduced to Basha B. Fraser, with whom I've now collaborated on another world history project on historical biographies for the World History Association. So in turn, I'm so grateful to Basha B for then connecting me to Scottish Penn. But first, let me provide some background on the project that I've just mentioned and that David so kindly introduced, Women Who Changed the World. In 4 volumes, this project selects about 200 biographical essays on women from all continents and all periods of world history. The essays have been conceived and written by a team of scholars around the world on all 6 continents. And while such a daunting enterprise can never be comprehensive in just 200 entries, the entries have been chosen to provide truly global coverage. And they also provide us with more than 3 million years of human history. Today, of course, I'll be dealing with just a handful of these 200 women through the thematic lens that I've chosen for this evening by discussing their interconnected lives. And I'd like to focus on a few of the earlier women from more ancient times, and also several of the women from the era and the world in which Helen Cruikshank also lived. Along with some of the world's most influential women, the entries include little known women, women you might not have heard of as well, providing a breadth of coverage that is globally complete and but also gives some historical depth and context of this ever evolving human story that is inclusive of women's experiences and their voices. So while millions of women have made significant contributions to the patterns of world history, not all are remembered in written documents, and fewer still in writings of their own. Yet one of the earliest, and in fact, the first signed piece of literature in world history was written by a woman, Enheduanna, the Sumerian woman who lived in the city of Ur. She wrote poems, she wrote hymns, dedicated to the powerful goddess of love and war, Inanna. She writes, "When humanity comes before you in awed silence at the terrifying radiance and tempest, you grasp the most terrible of all divine powers. Because of you, the threshold of tears is opened. You spread exhaustion with the storm winds while your own feet remain tireless." And although in modern times, we might feel humbled reading about the lives of women from ancient times to the past, the surviving stories of their very remarkable, but also in many ways ordinary lives, have the power to inspire us and confound us across the centuries. The scholar Philip Freeman observed in 2016 in his book of translations of the poetry of Sappho, the similarities between the lives of ancient and modern women are surprising, but the differences can be astonishing. So in the shorter term, we can see the granddaughters and the grandmothers who seem to have faced many of the same challenges and obstacles. And in the longer range of human experience, we can observe that the longings or the regrets of a 6th century BCE woman or a woman 4,000 years ago can resonate with the 21st. So considering the project's scope, it's been possible to ask of the group of women, these 200 women as a whole, whether the ability to change the world has similar characteristics in different individuals, societies, and eras, and whether that ability can in fact be predicted. Did it emerge in childhood? What was its recipe? Which relationships, which traits were integral to success and perseverance and impact? For those women who changed the world, what did they share in common? How did they persist into their final years without knowing whether their accomplishments might survive? So the search, I think, for patterns is to ask whether there's anything contemporary lives hold in common with these remarkable stories. Persistence, passion, sheer talent were never enough. All the women were born and they died, and in between, they made the most of whatever encounters with ideas and environments and people could be brought to their forge. I argue that bringing these individual lives into focus allows us also to grasp a fuller sense of a wider collective project of world history, one in which all people belong. So let's start at the beginning, their early years. What elements of personality and environment contribute to female agency? Being born into elite families, even against the stifling odds of patriarchy, never hurt one's chances of securing a position to change the world. Queens and scientists alike sometimes inherited opportunities by being born at the right opportune place and time. Yet many women, for example, Mary Wollstonecraft or Caroline Herschel, others, were self-taught essentially as professionals. And the first female millionaire was self-made, Madam C.J. Walker, the African-American entrepreneur. So well into the 20th century, women around the world have confronted their limited access to education or economic opportunity, as well as overcoming the forces that sought to silence them or even erase them from history books. So as children, their early years, many of these women sought opportunities to read and write. And at early ages, many did so even though they were denied formal access to education. They often wrote with extraordinary persistence, as in the case of Queen Victoria, whose daily entries in her private diaries were quite remarkable and continued from the age of 13 until days before her death in her 80s, and they run to 43,000 pages. Other children whose lives would change the world began as a child to observe nature intensely, such as Rachel Carson, seen here, who was largely homeschooled in the sciences by her mother, or they practiced the piano for hours at the age of 5, such as Clara Schumann. They sought out the elegance of mathematical equations. They began artistic production before they reached adulthood, as many of these other examples suggest. Clara Schumann's parents, for example, were both professional musicians, and she worked with her husband, the composer, Robert Schumann. And the nature artist Maria Sibyl Marion, shown here, got her start in a family of artists and publishers, but traveled alone with her daughter from Amsterdam to another continent, where the pair worked together in Suriname. And she was also, in addition to being an illustrator, she was a remarkable writer as well, and writing about bugs jumping out like shining candles from the bushes of Suriname in South America. So you get the idea. Many of these were people were trained by their parents. The Chinese poet artist was Guan Daosheng, was trained was afforded entry essentially into Chinese elite culture, which allowed her to receive patronage through her diplomat husband. And Caroline Herschel, of course, observed the stars for her brother, William. What of their mortality? Until the 18th century, women in most parts of the world lived to just about the same age, an average of 30 years. Beginning in the 19th century, that changed as global industrialization changed the chances of women living longer lives. Of course, their mortality, if they survived infancy, women faced the most difficult task, which was childbirth. And you see here on the left, the Leopoldina, the Empress of Brazil, and who died in her 20s in childbirth. Agencartini, who also died at the age of 25, a century later. Ada Gupi, on the other hand, inscriptions for this ancient woman reveal that she, or claim that she lived to the age of 103. So we have the beginnings, we have the endings, and and we have the in-between, those human connections that I argue are the most important of all. Family and friends and households and market associations, religious orders, institutions, communities of all sorts, global groups, local organizations, social movements. These were the human interconnections that allowed women to begin to impact the world as the world took a global turn in the 19th century. So it is in this context that we see women using those family connections, initiating those connections in order to forge their own path in life. But women also found that households weren't necessarily always positive. They could be cages, they could be sources of support, but nonetheless, critical human connections help to reshape the possibilities for women. Women traded their households in for relationships that were powerful, the unseen relationships with divinities and ancestors, gods and goddesses throughout world history, whether derived from the Yaxchixtlan religion of Lady Shock, shown here, Chiapas, Mexico in the 7th century, or the Babylonian beliefs of Adagupi, or the experience here of the Karakal Amayar, the Bhakti poet saint from India. These women found status and comfort and support, sanction and ecstasy by reaching into unseen realms, the realms that they inhabited spiritually, by belonging to any number of world religions. Women sometimes created institutions and religious communities or other communities to nurture themselves and to accomplish what they set out to. Mahapajapati, around the 5th century BCE, founded the Buddhist order of nuns. Teresa Avila, shown here on the right, founded the new Carmelite order. Sor Juana in Mexico, a century later in the 17th century, shown on the left, is posing in front of the library that she inherited from her father. She used her nunnery as and to establish her career as a writer under the protection of the nunnery in order to avoid marriage, which would have cut her off from access to any sort of career or activity, as particularly scholarly and writing. Fatima Alfiri, 9th century, and her sister Miriam are credited with founding a college, a madrasa, and 2 mosques in Fez, Morocco in the 9th century. And shown at the bottom here in the center is Tayatu Betul, who in the 19th century founded a city. The capital of Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, was founded by Betul. As women found strength and support within households, within families and groups as well, they fashioned and found support for their own personality, for their talents, for their political commitments. Institutions then housed women's resistance so that their impact was sometimes hidden. And I think one of the problems of elite women, about whom we know far more in the recorded past, is that their privilege and their wealth have skewed the historical lens of gender away from more subversive, widespread, and secretive accomplishments at a grassroots level. Women's lives began to change after the world took its global turn by creating social movements. Individual women gained camaraderie. They gained support from belonging to social movements and from other political resistance efforts, whether they were reading groups or international organizations, letter writing, institution building, both formal and informal. Women from one generation also learned from another. And this is evidenced in within families. It's evidenced within different parts of the world, women reaching out to one another. It's evidenced, for example, in the quite remarkable admiration that the science fiction writer Ursula Le Guin, who used to live in my neighborhood here, had for Naomi Mitchison, whom she called one of the great subversive thinkers and peaceable transgressors of the 20th century. Or as we might surmise from the fascination of Virginia Woolf with the Bronte sisters. So cross-generational connections were significant influencers. And the sad longevity of many social and political movements, from suffragists to anti-colonial freedom fighters to dreamers of alternative worlds, suggests that the significant political in social movements in the modern world were both transgenerational as well as global. So although not without its bumpy moments, the story of the Pankhurst family, shown here on the right, is an example of that homebrewed transgenerational activism that then goes global. Suffragist Emmeline Pankhurst, of course, herself the daughter of a feminist and socialist parents, started the Women's Social and Political Union in her home in October of 1903, and her daughters personally eventually carry its message to Australia and France and Italy and Ethiopia and the United States. On the left is Sophia Dulip Singh, the daughter of the exiled Maharaja of Punjab and the goddaughter, of course, of Queen Victoria, who engaged in her suffragist activity across the street from the palace, but also across the world. Among the most significant of 20th century social movements, in fact, were the struggles to achieve social justice, to achieve equality, to achieve peace. Women were abolitionists, they were suffragists, they were peace activists in causes that linked them together in increasingly global organizations. And among the most important was the Women's International Committee for Permanent Peace, founded by Jane Addams and Alice Hamilton and Emily Balch, who I want to talk about just for a moment, shown up here in the corner of this slide. A century later, the social movement for racial justice, of course, has sprung from Black Lives Matter, a global organization started by 3 African-American women in the United States, has now become the largest social movement in world history. But Balch went on eventually to win the Nobel Prize in the 1940s, in 1946. But she was, but I think perhaps her most important work may have been as a peace activist during World War I. And she's shown here en route to the International Congress of Women at The Hague with Jane Addams and others. Emily Balch's doctoral dissertation as well in economics was written in the 1890s based on an analysis of public assistance to the poor in France. So she studied as an American woman alone, lived alone in France, in Paris, during that period of time. Not all women, of course, opposed war, and here is the infamous Maria Bokchereva, who led the notorious women's battalion of death in World War I. She poses in her military garb in a very masculine pose. African and Asian and Latin American women also helped shape the activism of the 20th century through their own encounters in a global marketplace of ideas. Here was the South African Olive Schreiner, who was born at quite a remarkable moment of South African history. She wrote The Story of the African Farm under the pseudonym Ralph Iron, while saving money for her own medical education. She arrived in Edinburgh to study medicine in Scotland in 1881, but unfortunately became too ill to continue. But she benefited from the connections she made through a group called the Progressive Organization and other networks and gatherings of intellectuals. She went on to write the introduction for Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women, as well as many works of fiction and nonfiction that explored women and labor, sexuality, peace and war. Schreiner was both an abolitionist and a feminist. She, like many of the other women, was educated by her mother, but she associated with socialists and feminists in the radical Men and Women's Club in London. She was a close friend of Eleanor Marx and was known for her fiery speeches. She eventually did return to South Africa. Other transnational figures going global, Hermila Galindo de Topete was a feminist voice. She created her own journal, her own literary journal, in order to secure a community for her ideas. The progressive weekly journal, La Mujer Moderna, the Modern Woman, became an important voice for Latin American women as she transcended her own national boundaries of Mexico, traveled to Cuba, traveled to Chile, and other parts of Latin America. She became, her journal became a vehicle for Latin American women's voices and for extending full citizenship to women who had been denied legal rights once they married. She was a very progressive and persuasive speaker as well, as she visited different clubs of women and men and women which were gatherings of intellectuals. So the Scottish pen model is seen in many different parts of the world. Here's one final example, Mabel Lee. Although the Chinese-born Mabel Pinghua Lee would never vote herself, she was an ardent suffragist. She marched, or rather she rode on horseback in the parades. The 1912 New York City parade for women's suffrage, she led a section of Asian American women in the parade in 1917. So in the modern world, of course, many women have founded and belong to international organizations that work tirelessly on behalf of human rights and social and political reforms in the public sphere. But Mabel Lee did so as a Chinese woman, Chinese-born woman, living in the United States, where her own rights were denied by the racist and xenophobic US Exclusionary Act that was operating at the time. Nonetheless, Mabel Lee became the first woman to earn a PhD at Columbia University. She wrote a dissertation on Chinese agricultural technology and soil erosion and its impact on political change, only to have her research usurped by a man who turned it into the shining point of his career, an American engineer. So some women did travel abroad. They did so while crossing gender and national boundaries. Yet the constraints of domestic life, such as Helen Cruikshank faced, too often formed the basis of women's struggles to be heard and to be seen. Their invisibility resulted in inevitable historical bias. As societies became more complex, scholars have noted that inequalities increased. Consider then how truly radical it was to turn one's home into an intellectual haven, as did both Naomi Mitchison and Helen Cruikshank. They were part of the generation of women who reshaped activism, intervened in public conversation, who championed freedom of expression across borders. And as Jenny Calder points out, Helen Cruikshank nurtured Scottish writers, hosting the many early meetings of PEN and befriending and sustaining many other literary figures, including the writers Lewis Grassic Gibbon, Christopher Grieve, the shy William Souter, Willamure. Notably, Helen's connections spanned across the broadest range of subjects that women were tackling. They weren't just all poets or solely poets. Nan Shepherd wrote on nature. Marian Lockheed wrote on history. Marian McNeill wrote on cookery. Nanny Wells, of course, wrote endlessly on politics. So the network of her interconnections was a veritable who's who of literary wealth. Cruikshank lacked the privileged support of an aristocratic or wealthy family or a husband that Lady Mitchison and even Violet Jacob enjoyed. Both of those writers, Mitchison and Jacob, traveled to the far reaches of the British Empire, whether to India or Southern Africa, West Africa. Like many other women, Cruikshank may have wanted more for herself, but she had to settle for the domestic role that she could perhaps not have originally imagined as a young political activist. In one of Marian Angus's favorite poems of Cruikshank's, the Pawnage, she emphasizes the poem's theme of the search for self-identity and for connection. For many women, particularly at the onset of the World War eras, it proved to be a critical forge that time for social and political activism, for their expression, for their pacifist sentiments. The question of war pressed many women to action. It split the suffragists. It emboldened some women to seek traditionally male roles, yet other women sacrificed their husbands, their sons, their security in both world wars, while still others repurposed their households. And it's safe to say that many women writers found themselves in that pawnage, in that place of connections in relation to one another. So I think that finally closer examination of also reveals women's unique contributions to the fabric and the vibrancy of literary communities that operated within the level of family and household, as well as at the same time interacted with the larger social and political networks, the socioeconomic and political structures of their times. The words, the wisdom, the accomplishments, and even the failings of women offer historians and others, I think, an intimate glimpse of individual lives as well as collective lives. So finally, I guess I would say that like so many women whose lives and work sustains others and not necessarily themselves, the life and the career of Helen Cruikshank consisted of words and also connections, invitations to create and to interact in the kinds of interconnections that sparked more words. And in this way, they became interactions, I feel, that continued in their resonances, in their reverberations to change the world. It turns out then that historical biography, individual portraiture, is also a means by which we can witness the construction of community, of collective community. We are our best together. So I thank you again for joining me to celebrate the role of women writers, particularly those who have created and are still creating the interconnections that ensure that our best is given voice. So thank you very much. So let's see, I think I need to.
Thank you so much, Candice. I learned so much in such a short space of time. So I really appreciate the way you've brought such a varied history together and into such a clear and heartening narrative. I suppose from Scottish Pen's perspective, it's great to just see that spirit of solidarity between women, between writers, and that kind of intersection between, you know, human rights and art. I won't gush too much longer because I realise we don't have too much time for questions. I suppose just to kick off, I'd be really interested to hear whether you feel that sort of spirit of international solidarity and that kind of crossover between creative work and responding to the political climate that women find themselves in is still present today. Do you feel that spirit continuing in a modern context?
Oh, so much. So I particularly in this project, you know, I found myself having to reel in 200 essays from women all around the world who and men as well, but I would say about 2/3 of the writers for the project were women, and despite the pandemic, despite all of the you know, problems in their individual lives, they were so committed to the project. So it was very heartwarming to engage with so many people with such a positive spirit.
Yeah,
So yeah, I think it's alive. It's alive in your organization in Penn.
good. No, I'm really pleased to hear it, and especially in these times, it's great to be able to grasp onto that and realize those kind of common values are still there. So I suppose to pick a few questions from our chat, I suppose the first question is, where might research look in future to discover other interconnections between non-elite women's groups?
Yeah, well, I know I'm trained as an Africanist, so I have to say that Africanist historians have really led the way by using oral traditions. So I think that when women's voices in writing have maybe been altered or changed or ignored, they make up for it in oral traditions. So songs, performance art of all kinds, oral traditions, the stories told their children and grandchildren have helped to preserve the memory of many of their activities. I also work in the Caribbean, and I found that even in children's songs that are taught in the kitchen, embedded inside of them are messages of values of human societies, of means by which people passed on the wealth of knowledge in spite of being a part of an enslaved community. So it's remarkable how much can survive just through oral culture and popular culture.
Absolutely, and yeah, people find a way, and when those stories resonate, it's hard to suppress them, and that's great to hear. I suppose just to kind of build on that, then I've got a question asking what you think the best way forward is for increasing women's equality in future. That's a biggie.
Wow. Well, you know, one of the interesting things that I think comes out in Helen Cruikshank's life, it comes out in Emily Balch and her her emphasis on economic studies. She was an academic who lost her job teaching economics at a major college in the United States because of her pacifism. But these and other women have emphasized economic equality as the key. And I think that probably hasn't changed much in the past century, that we're still fighting to find equal ground for women. And of course, that's emerged even more during the pandemic as women found themselves being mostly caregivers, as at least in the United States, as schools closed and the lockdowns prevented children from going to school. It was women who gave up their jobs mostly. So equal pay, still a women's issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, lack of resource and access to the spaces where you could have a platform, but also just women's time, you know, and like you said, when people are balancing so many responsibilities, having that space to create and to be active is stripped so much. Okay, we've still got a little bit of time, so I'll just keep going if that's all right with you. Okay, so the next question is, are women well enough aware, in your opinion, of the resemblance between women's search for equality between different countries and continents?
Well, I hope that this project will contribute to that more global perspective, and many women, you know, were omitted from the project because what they didn't have that larger, wider global impact. And what we mean by global in different times, of course, differs tremendously, but beyond their own communities, more or less. So I hope that that work that is world historical, that has a global perspective embedded in it, will help people see those commonalities across a much wider region. Not that there aren't astonishing differences, as Phil Freeman points out, but there are also a lot of similarities.
Absolutely. We've got a question from Bashabi, who you mentioned earlier. During the COVID crisis, we have seen how many women leaders have handled the situation in their countries with empathy, sensitivity, and effectiveness. Do you feel that there is a new shift in the political leadership roles where gender may play a crucial role?
Yes, we can certainly. One of the 200 women in our project is Arden, you know, from the global South. So we can see the response of Australia and New Zealand being quite extraordinary and successful. I wish that were the case. I don't know. I live in a country where politics scares me these days. So what can we do to promote that?
Yeah, it's like it kind of relates to the previous question that, you know, we can have women in political leadership situations, but it's also about broadening those economic inequality access issues and ensuring that, yeah, that those representatives aren't a kind of hollow representation where there's vast inequality as well. So it has to work from both ends, I suppose. Yeah, thanks for that. Okay, I'm starting to scroll. Okay, let's see. Okay, here we go. Do you think that these oral histories of the non-elite women's groups can and should be treated as a kind of alternative or sub-alternative history?
You know, I think that history, like any subject, has many sides, many facets, and certainly it offers another facet that is necessary to understanding the reality, the historical reality of the past. Without, you know, a recognition of half the world's population, we have a very incomplete and ultimately a very biased picture. So yeah, I think that increasingly oral history is acknowledged. It has its limitations, just as written documents that are biased have their limitations. So as historians, I think we do have a responsibility to learn how to acknowledge their biases, their limitations, but they do provide alternative views and other perspectives that are absolutely essential to a fuller history of the past.
Thank you so much. I think with that, I'll bring Dave in to wrap us up, if that's all right, Dave. Thank you.
Absolutely. It really has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Candice, for that wonderful talk. I learned an awful lot during it personally, and I thank you personally for that. But I think the way you've been able to look across history and across nations and across cultures has been absolutely wonderful. And so I can only say thank you. we're very, very honoured to have you here as our first speaker on the Helen Cruikshank lecture. I found out more about Helen Cruikshank as well than I knew from your talk, so thank you so much for including her and Naomi Mitchison in your talk. We're very proud of her here, of course, and Naomi Mitchison, and their considerable contribution to Scottish work and to international work too. And thank you very much for everything. It's been absolutely wonderful to have you here. We're just going to wrap up now for everybody who's come along, and say thank you to everybody for having come along. Candice has been a fantastic inaugural speaker, and I must say that we had one or two little glitches there, particularly with the co-hosting of the chat, and she coped wonderfully well with these sudden changes we had to make. So thank you very much, Candice. Now I think everybody is muted, so my applause will have to suffice for everybody, unless people can unmute and come in. And if they can't, I'd just like to say thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we hope to see you in Scotland sometime, Candice. Are you thinking of coming over at any point?
Absolutely. My ancestry DNA tells me that that's my homeland.
This is where you must spend some time then. That's great. Lovely to see you and lovely to hear your talk.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.